Thank you, everybody. Kwe, Liwi, Zibani Newsome, Naga Panwabskownil, Naga Gaki Gamidnil, Naga Nudal Get. Greetings, my name is Bonnie Newsome. I'm a citizen of the Penobscot Nation, and I'm also an archaeologist and a teacher at the University of Maine. I chose to start this presentation with the Wabanaki language to really set the tone for my talk today, because I view the integration of archaeology and Indigenous languages as having transformative effects on the discipline, not only in how we engage in archaeological practice, but also in how we interpret the lives of past peoples and how we care for our heritage spaces. Today, I'm presenting on an archaeology project that I'm working on with Acadia National Park, Schoodic Institute, and Indigenous communities in Maine. And it's a project that attempts to integrate Indigenous perspectives with archaeological inquiry and climate change impacts on heritage spaces. And I approach my research through an Indigenous archaeologies framework, which is archaeology with and for Indigenous peoples. This kind of archaeology really empowers Indigenous peoples in the archaeological arena and supports Indigenous values and agendas. And I follow this approach in an effort to give Indigenous peoples a more prominent voice in archaeology and heritage site stewardship in all of my work, but particularly with this project in Acadia National Park, this type of approach works really well. So this work is also aligned with the Indigenous Declaration in support of the March for Science and their vision for productive symbiosis between Indigenous and Western knowledges. The Declaration states that we envision a productive symbiosis between Indigenous and Western knowledges that serve our shared goals of sustainability for land and culture. And this symbiosis requires mutual respect for the intellectual sovereignty of both Indigenous and Western sciences. And the question becomes, how does symbiosis emerge? And in our research with Acadia, we're attempting to inspire productive symbiosis by integrating Wabanaki values and Western archaeological science and resource stewardship. And productive symbiosis is not new to Wabanaki people. For centuries, we've interacted with each other and others through what's called the Wabanaki Confederacy. And this is the symbol here on this slide. And we often address issues collectively, and we support each other and we maintain our close relationships. Yet one end, you'll notice that one end of the symbol is open, and that allows for members of the Confederacy to come and go as they please. And so those kind of Wabanaki philosophies influence the archaeological practices discussed here. And we're approaching this project together for the benefit of all of our communities. So by way of background, I'd like to, before I get into the details of the project, I want to orient you geographically and culturally with these three maps. The one on the left shows the ancestral territory of the Indigenous peoples of the area now known as Maine and the Canadian Maritimes. And the map on the right shows the contemporary location of the 4 federally recognized tribes in Maine and their community centers. And then the map in the center shows the National Park Service and their lands in Maine. And there are 3 primary areas in the region where the National Park Service manages lands and resources. The one in north central Maine is a relatively new national monument called Katahdin Woods and Waters. The one on eastern Maine's border is referred to as the St. Croix International Historic Site. And the one on Maine's coast is Acadia National Park. And the Park Service in this region is working very hard to partner and consult with Indigenous peoples in carrying out their responsibilities to care for these lands and the cultural and natural resources that exist there. The Park Service acknowledges that they're operating within Wabanaki ancestral territory, which is here, as I mentioned, illustrated on the right. And just for your information, the term Wabanaki, it refers to people of the dawn or people of first light, because we are kind of the first peoples to see the sunrise. And we view the term Wabanaki as kind of a collective term for all of us. And in my research and the research that I'm doing in collaboration with the Park Service and the Wabanaki communities focuses on the archaeological and cultural heritage of these communities. So the Wabanaki people have a 12,000-year history here, and much of the record of that history is encapsulated in subsurface archaeological spaces. Oral narratives and intergenerational memory and petroglyph sites document that history pretty well. The image on the left is Wabanaki artist Toma Joseph's rendition of Gluskab. And Gluskab is an Indigenous culture hero who's said to be responsible for the creation of people by shooting an arrow into the ash tree, which is our basket tree. And then people actually emerged from that tree. He's also said to be responsible for many of the geologic features we see around Maine. And for example, in Penobscot Bay, a quartz vein near Castine is the result of Gluskab killing a moose and throwing the entrails across the bay. Other features such as the Penobscot River in Maine and Mount Kineo, where much of our stone tools are sourced from, are also connected to Gluskab's activities. So Gluskab actually helped shape Wabanaki Homeland, and as such, oral narratives like these are a source of information for understanding Indigenous peoples' worldviews and lifeways. In the center is a photo of Passamaquoddy petroglyphs from Machias Bay, which is in the far eastern corner of Maine. These images are pecked into stone outcrops, and they're also a way to kind of convey information and knowledge. These petroglyphs exist along the shoreline, and they date to roughly the last 3,000 years to the contact period. And these petroglyph images are vulnerable to sea level rise, irregular freeze-thaw cycles, and vandalism. And finally, the image on the right is a photograph of archaeological excavations at a site in Eddington, Maine. And you can see that deep features in this stratigraphy here, but the point of this image is to show that places such as Eddington Bend and other places along Maine's coast, this is not a coastal site, but other sites in Maine preserve Indigenous pasts. And bringing some of these knowledges can be challenging sometimes. Bringing these knowledges together can be challenging, particularly because Indigenous peoples have been denied access to past cultural materials and landscapes, really through rigid curation policies and land alienation. So as an archaeologist, I specialize in ceramic analysis, and I like to use the ceramic manufacturing process as an analogy for thinking about marginalization of Indigenous knowledge, particularly within the realm of archaeology. Ceramic manufacturing is an additive process, and this kind of differs from stone and bone tool production, which requires, kind of the reduction of raw materials in order to achieve a desired outcome. When a pot is made, you start out with kind of basics like good clay from the earth and water. And as the potter proceeds to create her pot, she makes decisions along the ceramic sequence, and these decisions are situated within her intellectual realm and her cultural context. And so Indigenous peoples here in Maine added temper to their clay, just like everywhere else in the world. And this improved pot performance and workability. And these materials generally consist of crushed shell or crushed granite. In some regions, we also see evidence of balsam fir needles used as temper. But after they blend their materials together, they shape and dry their pot. And once dried, the potter's creation is fired and it undergoes a transformation. And once this happens, that pot can actually serve her and her family or be traded or gifted. So I see this as a good analogy for how we think about archaeology and Indigenous knowledge processes, particularly within an Indigenous archaeology's framework. As Indigenous archaeologists, we start with a basic understanding of our past that's rooted in the cultural and intellectual processes that have shaped us. And as we conduct our archaeological research, we add those to we add those to our knowledge base using what's available to us. And those things include things such as elder teachings, language, stories, histories, and even our lived experiences in our ancestors' teachings. And we blend all this together, much like a potter does. And it not only, we blend it not only kind of intellectually, but also socially and spiritually as well. So when we think about knowledge, it's important to understand that it's a progressive kind of thing. And in kind of extending that analogy, it's important to point out that the life history of the pot does not end when it breaks or ceases to function well as a container. The pot breaks down and it has the potential to remain in process within the community. For example, sherds of the pot may be crushed up and integrated into a new pot as temper, or they may be used as teaching tools for pottery making, or kept as an heirloom to remember someone by, or they could even be swept into a debris pile to fill in a divot somewhere. The point here is that Indigenous peoples are free to engage with that pot for as long as they choose to, in whatever way they choose to. So colonization has disrupted our relationship with our material past, and as well as the cultural spaces that kind of contain some of these materials. And it's when we think about community engagement and working collaboratively on stewardship decisions, it's sometimes difficult for our community partners to feel informed enough to contribute to stewardship decisions. And so there's a disconnect between contemporary peoples and not necessarily memory of the place, but access to materials and space in order to kind of keep that knowledge system flowing. So climate change is compounding the problem. Loss and damage, particularly non-economic loss and damage, is creating more distance between Indigenous peoples and our past, or their past. As archaeologists, this is one area where we play, where we can have an active role in narrowing that distance and healing kind of that fractured relationships. Indigenous communities are particularly vulnerable to climate change, and there's been a lot of research and literature about this. Daniel Wildcat in particular has written a lot on this. And they're especially vulnerable because of the close connections between cultural heritage, kin ties to place, and natural spaces. And very often Indigenous communities have multi-generational ties to place that really when that place is disrupted through climate change, that disrupts the whole social system. So they're considered, Indigenous peoples are considered to be vulnerable, especially vulnerable in terms of climate change. So I'm going to turn now to talk a little bit about one of the heritage spaces and how climate change is affecting Indigenous peoples in Maine. Our cultural heritage with regard to coastal shell-bearing archaeological sites is one of these areas where we're struggling a lot with climate change. For Maine's Indigenous communities, these sites are remnants of a built heritage that help tell the story of our ancestors and our cultural connections to place. Maine is home to roughly 2,000 Indigenous shell heaps, and these represent nearly 5,000 years of Native families living on the coast. And these are all threatened by sea level rise, increasing storm intensity, irregular freeze-thaw cycles, and looting. So this is one area where, in terms of Indigenous knowledge, we don't have it. When we lose these sites, we won't have the opportunity to kind of reconnect to our past. Here in Maine, these deposits may be thin layers of shell within the site, or shell deposits can be as much as 1 meter thick in some places. Most shell heaps in Maine are constructed of soft shell clam, although we do have oyster shell heaps as well. And the oyster shell heaps occur in specific areas in Maine. Occasionally, we'll also see quahogs in shell heaps in Maine, but these are really uncommon. So perhaps one of the most notable characteristics of shell heaps in Maine is their preservation of varied data sets. And we can see some examples of those here. They preserve human and environmental and material culture spanning millennia, and bone and stone and ceramic tools and faunal materials and organics are really well preserved at these locations, as are the remains of extinct species like the sea mink and great auk. Rarely do we get the same level of preservation on non-shell sites in Maine. In fact, because Maine soils are so acidic, without shell heap sites, we would not have the opportunity to learn from, study, or otherwise engage with much of the material culture that's preserved in Indigenous shell heaps. So importantly, I think it's not just about the stuff. Shell heaps preserve information on past Indigenous lifeways, and this includes information regarding responses to past climate change, social structure, movement across the landscape, and intercultural relationships. And as such, these are really valuable to Wabanaki communities, and they help to make a connection between past and present peoples. So Wabanaki people have long maintained their connections intellectually to shell heaps, and good examples of this can be found in the 19th century writings of Joseph Nicola, who was, among other things, Penobscot representative to the Maine legislature. Joseph Nicola self-published Life and Traditions of the Red Man, which is a book that he wrote to narrate the Penobscot traditions in oral narratives. And he wanted to publish them for a broad audience. And he drew from his personal knowledges, believing that Indigenous peoples were the only ones qualified to convey information about Indigenous lifeways. Among Nicola's stories are references to shellfish and shell heaps. And for example, he shares a story where Gluskab takes a journey across the land, and along the way he encounters people and animals who guide him in various aspects of life. And so one encounter was with May, the woodpecker, and May helps him kill this giant serpent from the ocean. And as a mark of friendship, Gluskab dips his arrow into the bloody ocean waters and touches May's head, marking him as a friend forever. After the serpent is killed, May flies away towards the setting sun, but returns frequently to bring Gluskab food. And then one morning, Gluskab wakes up to the sound of a dog barking from the direction of the setting sun, and he calls to the animal, and the dog appears with meat in his mouth, which he places at Gluskab's feet. And so, appreciative of Gluskab's effort to kill the serpent, the dog says, "I have come to stay with you. I shall stay where and when you stay, and I shall go when and where you go." Eventually, the woodpecker stops bringing food to Gluskab because it was time for Gluskab to find his own food and, kind of go out on his own and be his own person. And this is when the dog steps into his role as companion, and he takes Gluskab to the mud flats near the edge of the water and shows him where and how to get shellfish. So the dog is actually the being that brought shellfish to the lives of the Wabanaki. Later in his narratives, Joseph Nicola references the oyster shell heaps. Specifically in one story, he notes that women elders came from the south and were allowed to take the oysters so long as their people did not bother the elderly or the sick. And this enabled people from both the north and the south to benefit from the oysters. And he writes, these oyster beds were so productive that it gave a supply to all that wished for the period of many times 70 years, so that the shells of this food fish was piled up almost mountain high on the shore of a riverbank for a long distance. And so you can see that here by this example, that Wabanaki people have kind of maintained a connection to the shell heaps through their oral narratives. So with that as background, I want to turn now to Acadia National Park, the location of the research that I'm working on. Acadia is home to 24 known Indigenous cultural spaces, most of which are coastal shell heaps or shell mounds threatened by climate change and sea level rise and human impacts. Indigenous cultural spaces here range from roughly 4,000 years ago to 500 years and reflect past lifeways of Indigenous families who left behind belongings, gifts, creation, art, activity areas. And in my work, I often use these terms as opposed to things like stone and bone tools, pottery, food remains, and features, because it reflects this notion of ancestors providing us with gifts that we are able to now learn from and use. Like sites elsewhere in Maine, sites in Acadia are experiencing erosion, and the Park Service has undertaken an initiative to co-manage or co-steward archaeological sites with the Wabanaki tribes, and they consult routinely with tribal historic preservation offices and include them in the decision-making processes about climate change and other effects on heritage spaces. So this is an image of Frazer Point, which is the site that that we're working on most extensively. And you can see there the erosion in a couple places here along the shoreline. And this is at another part of the site, a non-shell space at the site that's also eroding and getting hit pretty hard. Shell mound research in Acadia National Park has been intermittent and therefore has created some problems with collaborative stewardship. There's been limited study of the materials of Wabanaki ancestors, and this has created a gap in knowledge about Maine's Indigenous peoples and our connections to Acadia National Park. Because our current understandings of Indigenous cultural spaces is sparse, park staff have really been ill-equipped to discuss site contents with the community. Additionally, European contact has disrupted Indigenous engagement with cultural spaces, past peoples, and practices. And because of kind of this inhibited access to cultural spaces, we don't have the necessary, or Wabanaki communities don't have the necessary information to advise the park on appropriate stewardship. So we need to know what's there. And what activities have taken place at a particular location in order to have kind of a meaningful dialogue about site stewardship. And so we initiated a project to kind of start moving in a direction where Wabanaki communities could be better informed and make more informed decisions about co-management or co-stewardship of some of these sites. So the initial phase of this project was designed to really reconnect Indigenous communities with heritage spaces and address some of these challenges by using it in existing collections as a basis for learning more about pre-colonial Wabanaki relationships with Acadia National Park lands. And we had three initial goals. One was to kind of address that gap in knowledge through reanalysis of select cultural materials. And we selected 2 locations, but I'll be talking only about one today. Our second goal was to use that information as a basis for knowledge exchange and communication with Maine tribes and other stakeholders. And the third goal was to build skills among Wabanaki interns. And this in turn will build capacity in the communities to take the lead on archaeological interpretation and research. So we focused on 2 sites, as I mentioned. One was Isla Ho down here, and the other is Frazer Point, which I'll share additional information about Frazer Point here today. Frazer Point is located on Schoodic Peninsula, and we selected Frazer Point because several reasons. We had a robust collection of material culture and records because archaeology had been done there in the past. There were existing reports on excavations and materials. The site represented diverse time periods and site types. And there's also an ethnohistoric or historic component to the work done at Frazer Point. So that was another layer of evidence that we could draw from to interpret the site. So Frazer Point archaeology started in the 1970s with excavations by the University of Maine. It's a soft shell clam shell heap. Notable remains include great auk and sea mink. Dr. David Sanger and UMaine students conducted these early studies. Unfortunately, the information on this research and this work has been locked away, and Indigenous peoples haven't had access to these data because the Park Service has regulations and rules that make these reports confidential. And so this information was never shared with Indigenous peoples before this project. They had people, the tribal historic preservation officers did have access, but there was no mechanism in place to make sure that this information and the tribal historic preservation officers were brought together essentially. So Frazer Point is undergoing erosion, as as I mentioned, and we know that there were essentially two periods of use of Frazer Point by Indigenous peoples, one at approximately 2,000 years ago, and then there seems to be a break in use, and then there's another episode of Indigenous use of this space around 1,000 years ago and later. There's also a post-contact use of Frazer Point. A freed slave by the name of Thomas Frazer set up a homestead here on Frazer Point, and we're doing some research in that arena too to see if there are connections between Thomas Frazer and Wabanaki people and to understand his story a little more. But there's also a possible late archaic component to the site as well, which dates to roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. So the initial research at Frazer Point was a couple of years ago, and I worked with two archaeology graduate students who assisted me with kind of a reanalysis of the material culture from the early 1970s excavations. And this is Isaac St. John, and he is actually the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer now for the Holton Band of Maliseet Indians, and Natalie Dana Lola, who is Passamaquoddy in Penobscot. She's actually working for the Tribal Historic Preservation Office at the Passamaquoddy tribe now, and both of them were graduate students at the start and are still working on their graduate degrees. And they both brought their own identities, experiences, and insights to the work and integrated Wabanaki language terminology into their analysis. The students drew heavily from the Maliseet Passamaquoddy language portal to identify terminology to describe some of the material culture, and they reconnected the material culture to Indigenous words and terms in order to understand better how the people who lived at Frazer Point 2,000 years ago may have spoken about some of these items. As we worked through that process, the students generated kind of a list of terminology, and not only does this help inform kind of the archaeological research and archaeological interpretation, but it also strengthens students' language skills as well. And so this was really important in terms of their own language knowledge, and to situate that within the realm of archaeology strengthens them as Indigenous archaeologists. This is a copy of the form that we use. We're all trained in Western approaches to archaeological analysis, and so we did that work, but we also added, you'll see here down in red, we added this aspect or this attribute of Wabanaki language, and what terminology can we use as Wabanaki people to kind of describe these items. And these are just some of the terms that that describe some of the materials. Penobsc is the word for stone, and Mosalunksgozodi is the term for clay pot. Interestingly, an arrowhead in the language is inanimate, whereas a pot is animate. And I think we can see here a glimpse of how those two items may have been interpreted in kind of an an Indigenous worldview or Wabanaki worldview. So we conducted much of that work and did much of the analysis, and brought in some of these words, and we needed to figure out how to get information and the things we were learning about the collections to the Wabanaki communities. And this all occurred during the time of the pandemic. And so ideally, we would take this information in person, but we were not able to do that during the time of the initial study. So we created a webinar series, and it was really designed for Wabanaki communities, education and outreach. And there were 3 webinars that we created through this process. One was an introduction to shell heaps, just a very broad overview of what a shell heap is. The second webinar centered on a case study using the Acadia shell heaps as a basis for information about what we know about Acadia and some of the problems associated with stewardship of some of these locations. And the third webinar was one that focused on sea level rise and climate change impacts. And Dr. Alice Kelly, who's on the call today, helped us with that in order to help communities understand what some of the impacts and what are some of the threats to cultural shell heaps are in Acadia National Park and beyond. That was funded by the George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Studies. And those webinars were designed specifically for Wabanaki communities, but we are working now to get the permissions necessary to bring them to a broader audience. So subsequent to the webinar series and the work that was done with the material culture analysis, we applied for and were awarded a National Trust Grant for, it was the Telling the Full History grant, and we focused on Frazer Point for this grant specifically. And this was $50,000 to kind of re-examine some of the muted histories at Frazer Point. And that included both the Indigenous history there, as well as the Thomas Frazer story. One of the aspects of this grant was to host a community workshop where we, again, wanted to reconnect people with some of the material culture that had been excavated from Frazer Point. And we drew from both the Thomas Frazer homestead as well as the Indigenous site that was there as well. We brought together people, archaeologists who had experience in material culture analyses such as faunal materials, as well as historics and lithics and ceramics. And we brought in fluent speakers, and you can see here the woman with magnifying glass, that's Madonna Soktoma, she's Passamaquoddy. In this center photo, we have Maynard Marshall, who's Mi'kmaq, as well as John Dennis, who's Mi'kmaq. Edwina Mitchell here is Maliseet, and we have a couple of folks who are Dr. Rick Will and Julie Woods, who helped us with kind of helping community members understand how we as archaeologists approach our analysis. And we actually use the materials that have been locked away at Frazer Point for decades in order to give people the opportunity to engage with the collections. Now, these 4 folks are fluent speakers, and so we had the good fortune to hear their perspectives and record some of their interpretations of these materials in their languages. And so it was a really successful workshop, and I think everybody came away from it feeling like we were actually moving forward in terms of some sort of co-stewardship or collaborative work around Frazer Point. We also did a site visit, and so we got people out there on the land, showed them the site, and some hadn't been there or had been there and didn't realize that there was this archaeological history associated with this space. And so visiting the space was a really important part of connecting or reconnecting people with the particular location. So our next steps, the workshop was this past summer. Our next steps in terms of connecting and moving to the next level is to host a community based outreach initiative, which we actually go to the Wabanaki communities. And so the communities members that we've worked with have been tribal historic preservation officers and fluent speakers. Our webinar was an outreach to everybody with a particular hope that we would get teachers involved. But our next step really is to take this information and share it with within the community so that we can reach a broader audience. Additionally, in May, I'm offering a May course, a 3-week May term course that will have 2 weeks of in-class lessons around the archaeology of Maine. And the 3rd week of that course, we will be at Frazer Point using testing an iPhone app for monitoring site erosion that we're working on developing in collaboration with the University of Maine Midden Minders program. And so the students will take part in that. We'll also bring in fluent speakers and historic preservation officers to work with the students during that week as well. We are in the process of creating additional outreach tools, enhancing the National Park Service website, a curriculum unit for K-12 teachers, and units designed specifically for Wabanaki communities. And we are also looking to, through all of these processes, we're looking to identify ways to address potential cultural loss. And hopefully, you know, using Frazer Point as an example, some of the information that we gleaned from our tribal partners moved us towards some potential ideas and things like vegetation, you know, blocking off certain areas, having some sort of land acknowledgement at Frazer Point that articulates how Indigenous peoples were kind of removed from this land. So those are some of the ideas that people actually brought forth during this kind of workshop experience. So I will say, though, that this initiative is rooted in partnerships, and we have had a lot of support, and you know, this work isn't done in a vacuum. And so one of the things about community engaged work is making change in how archaeology is carried out involves a lot of people. And so the Abbey Museum, we had an advisory committee that we worked with early on that was focused specifically on archaeology. All of the tribal historic preservation officers and their staff have been involved. University of Maine and my program, as well as the Maine Midden Minders, which is a citizen science initiative designed to help monitor shell heap erosion. That initiative has played a key role in a lot of this work. Schoodic Institute, which is kind of a nonprofit arm to Acadia National Park, National Park Service, and of course, the Senator George Mitchell Center for Sustainability Solutions have all kind of helped us carry out some of these activities associated with this project. So with that, I would just like to say Chi Wiliwan, great thanks, particularly to our Wabanaki ancestors for sharing their lives with us in this really intimate way. Thanks also to our Wabanaki contributors who make this work so meaningful. We're all enriched and strengthened by this experience. And we also want to thank our friends who support our work with the Wabanaki ancestors in Acadia National Park. And I would like to thank Nahar for inviting me today, and I'm happy to take any questions that you may have. Now, these are some references too. I'll just share those with you, and they'll be on the slide if anyone has any interest in those.